So I was thinking, I remember when we talked about inversions of triads, I remember saying, oh, I wish I had some way I could show you that these are just basically rotating through. And so I finally came up with an idea. Let's space these out right. Something about like that. If you've seen my, if you've noticed my desktop background, it probably won't surprise you to know that I have a bin of Legos sitting around in my office, which seemed like a nice little visual aid. Let's get the staff here. So if we've got a seventh chord, any seventh chord at all, doesn't matter which one, something like that. So we talked about triads using the little wheel of thirds. Seventh chords also using the wheel of thirds, right? So for instance, some kind of an F, some kind of an A, some kind of a C, some kind of an E. Mode doesn't really matter here. Could be major, could be minor, diminished, whatever. You have to have this arrangement of thirds. And the way to find the root is to, mentally or with pencil and paper, rotate the seventh chord so that it looks like this, so that it looks like an arrangement of thirds here. For our purposes, I'm going to highlight the root. These are just little Lego wheel rims that are supposed to have tires on them. So the root gets to have the actual tire. So figured bass or chord symbols for these are going to go based on the same principles that we had with the triads. That we assume, right, that 3 and 5 are kind of there by default. If you have a chord, a triad in root position, or a seventh chord in root position, you're going to have a third, you're going to have a fifth, and you don't really need to include those in the figure. What you do need to include is the seventh, right? So these we don't need, but we do want to say 7. So for instance, 5, 7, 2, 7, that's where you get this simple bass figure. So if we want to see the next ones, I wanted to sort of illustrate the rotation here. If you want to find the root of a chord, go and find an inversion, or vice versa. Think about this actually just as an operation of like moving a physical thing up to the top. Now the root is on the top, and it has this sort of characteristic looking arrangement. A triad here, but instead of a third on top, you've got a step on top. So if we go through, what are the intervals? If I want to be complete here and write all the intervals, what are the intervals from the bottom note involved? Jade?
3, 5, and 6.
3, 5, and 6, yeah. Oops. So we start, as we get into seventh chords, we start to need to understand the rules a little bit more. There's a whole set of rules for when you do and don't need the figures under something. So like I said, one of those basic rules is you don't need the basic third and fifth. We assume those are there unless we're told otherwise, so we don't need them. Same thing here, we don't need the third, we assume it's otherwise. But the fifth we do need in this case, because sort of the next rule after that is if it's dissonant, you need it. So if it's a dissonance like a seventh is a dissonant interval, or if two figures are dissonant against each other. So if you put a sixth and a fifth next to each other, this is dissonant, right? So the sixth and the fifth are bumping up against each other, therefore you need both. So we can leave out the third, but we want to call this 6-5. So first inversion of a seventh chord is called a 6-5. 5-6-5, 2-6-5, whatever. That's what we have there. Next, we want to take the next one and rotate it. We'll need a ledger line, but we'll move the whole thing over here. Wait a second, where were we? I'll take my A and throw it up. Did not give myself enough space there. That can be my ledger line instead. There you go. Just pretend I didn't make that other one. So, second inversion, seventh chords, also, I think, have a kind of a distinctive look here. 2/3 offset by a step. You know, it's good, for example, for our 2Z, to learn to kind of recognize these visually, what they look like, in order to help you figure them out quickly. So again, we have the root here, F, A, C, E. Now the fifth is on the bottom, and if we go through this set of intervals, what am I going to have if I want to do all the intervals again? Somebody else give me, what are my figures going to be? Harry.
6, 4, and 3.
6, 4, and 3. Yeah, so 3, 4, 6. So, looking at what I can end up leaving out, now my third is one of these dissonances, right? Because the third, the E here, is still dissonant with the F in this arrangement. So I need to have the 4 and the 3, and I end up leaving out the 6. So this is the rules getting even more complicated. If we want to have only 2 numbers, we leave out the least important. But 6 is still a little bit out of the ordinary, right? So you sort of have to know that 4, 3 also implies 6. You will see, you know, chords that have 6, 4, 3. Once we do sort of figured bass without chord symbols, you'll see that 6, 4, 3 in there. And so finally, if we want to move one more set up here, I won't make the same mistake. I'll measure out where I need to have my other ledger line right there. Something like this. Right. Yet one more arrangement of our tones. Now we sort of have a triad with the 7th on the bottom. So what do I have? Here's my F major triad starting from the root, and I just add this dissonant 7th right there on the bottom. All right. So Ainsley, I didn't call on you last time, but what's the arrangement of intervals here for all of my figures? It's yeah, let's see, 2, yeah, 4 and 6, exactly. So for these, in much the same way, we'll leave out the 6th because it's the most consonant thing out there, even though it's not a 3rd or a 5th, and we'll put the dissonant 4 and the dissonant 2. So for instance, a 5, 4, 2 chord would be this 3rd inversion with the 7th on the bottom. So all of these positions here, we'll go ahead, now that I've sort of done this, fill them all in. This one was, just pretend that didn't exist. And then finally, sweep this away. There you go. So there's your sort of set of chords in inversion. I know you have this in the back of your sheet, but it might be helpful to look at them and think of them this way, or hear them. This is the major, which, as I said, is not all that common. So if we turn this into a dominant 7th chord, we get something that's a little bit more common. If we pretend this E is flat in all of these, so this becomes a 5/7 chord. It's going to go to 5, or maybe it can go this way. there any questions about kind of the rotation there of these things through their different chord positions? Ainsley.
So when you're writing these,
Mhm.
how do you know which like side the note goes on? The ones that are close together, because sometimes they're
Yeah.
to the left and sometimes they're to the right.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. A lot of times, this is something that kind of varies with different publishers, different eras of music. I would say I think it's accepted that the most correct thing is to sort of stack up all the kind of thirds and consonant notes that you can on the left. Then when you need to shift, you usually shift it to the right and go up from there. So kind of the most correct thing is some kind of an arrangement that kind of looks like this, with like some chords starting from the bottom, the consonants is kind of going up towards the top, but it could be, that it's like this, it goes over that way, or it could be most of them like this, like that. That's kind of considered the most correct. This is weird, or like this with the odd note out over here, or even like in between. This is a little more conventional, but if you put the odd note out over here, this is a little bit weird. So you will especially see like 18th, 19th century printings of music that have things that look really strange to our eyes. But this is like what your Muse score or Sibelius is going to do automatically. It's going to put your chord together like that with sort of everything it can over to the left. And then if you have other notes, they'll go off to the right of the chord. That's usually the way that it'll be written now. Yeah, good question. Any other questions about inversions and positions of seventh chords? All right, so I want to show one more thing before we get into doing this with music. I want to just kind of emphasize that thing I was saying about tendency tones. So we've talked about dominant going to tonic, right? As I said, we're going to do this exercise again. So let's say that we're in the key of C, right? And we want to have some kind of a 5/7 going to 1. Oh, that's off the top. There we go. Some kind of a 5/7 going to 1. So I don't know if I quite brought enough Legos here to show all of this. But let's start with this sort of basic thing, right? We've got our root position 7th chord. Something like that. Pretend that I spaced this out right. G, B, D, F. So we have our root, that gets the little outline, but we have 2 tendency tones here, right? What are those tendency tones? It's almost easier to ask which one's not a tendency tone. Ainsley.
Wait, which one is not?
Yeah, just tell me which ones are, what you were originally going to do.
B and F.
Yeah, B and F. So B in the key of C is the leading tone, and F is the 7th of the 7th chord. So to a certain degree, every 7th in a 7th chord you want to be a little bit conscious of. We'll talk about this probably on Friday, the standard resolution. But every 7th wants to step down if possible. When it's a 5/7, it must step down because it's fa to mi. So this one, must, let's say it's yellow, must step down. That gets a tendency tone, and then B, the leading tone, we'll say it's red. Really, really, really must step up. So your red here is going to go up to C. Your yellow here is going to step down to C. And I don't quite have enough notes here, but let's use these empty wheel rims, empty tires, to say this one has to go here, this one has to go here. So when you encounter these chords in different positions, you want to make sure that these tendency tones go where they should, right? So the root, if we're just going to a root position, the root can leap downwards to C, but the tendency tones need to go by step down to the nearest chord, kind of wherever they are. And then that little odd one out, the fifth, the sort of underappreciated, least important quote-unquote note of a seventh chord, picks up whichever one of these notes is convenient and can be done without parallels. So it could go from D down to C, it could go from D up to E. You kind of make that decision based on the musical conditions. You know, what can I do without creating parallel octaves, without creating, tripling the third and not emphasizing the root or something like that. You want to have it be nice and balanced. But really, the notes that matter are these. The root is going to go down to the other root, let's say. Then your leading tone is going to go up. Your seventh is going to go down. And the main reason I wanted to sketch that out is because this still happens even in the other positions. So even if I'm maybe in 6-3 or 6-5 position, right? Now I'm in first inversion. Still, my leading tone, the lowest note of the chord, has to go up. My seventh, the fa, has to go down to mi. Ti, do, fa, mi. And that has to happen no matter where these things are. So if I've rotated it enough that this is up here on top, nice high B, it gets to go to the C, still up here. That has to go up like that. F still goes down to E. And then finally, the really interesting one, let's move all of this back down onto the staff so we don't have to move with a ton of ledger lines. If I have a 4-2 chord, my seventh is in the bass, right? And then I've got my root. Here's your nice stack up in this direction, Ainsley. And my fifth on top. So the seventh here must go downwards while the leading tone goes upwards. So leading tone gets to go up here. The seventh must go down here. And then, we can fill in the G. So what position or what Roman numeral here, if I have a tonic chord that now ends like this, if I'm in C and I am with E in the bottom, what's my Roman numeral and figure for this? It's not 1, but Jade. 1-6, exactly. So one of the interesting quirks here is that when you're dealing with a 4-2 chord, or particularly a 5-4-2 chord like that, it's always going to resolve to a 1-6. It's not going to go to a root position chord. All the rest of them, 5-7, 5-6-5, 5-4-3, all are likely to go to a root position 1 chord. But this one, because I have that dissonance on the bottom and it's my seventh, it wants to resolve like this. So from me, and I end up, with a third in bass instead of the root. Consequently, you're not going to end a piece like this generally. A 5-4-2 is something that happens in the middle of something. Maybe it's in the middle of a phrase. Maybe, as we'll talk about, it's sort of expanding or alternating with the tonic, but it demands continuation. You can go from. You're probably going to keep going and maybe go fa, so, do. You kind of end up doing over. But this is one of these little music theory axioms to memorize. 5-4-2 always goes to 1-6. It's really the only chord that it can go to. Other things, we have deceptive cadences that we'll learn. There are ways to make it so 5 doesn't go to 1. 5-4-2 has to go to 1-6. The only place that you'll ever really see it go, particularly in a theory classroom. 5-4-2 always to 1-6 because that fa goes to mi, chord seventh has to go down, and it ends up being on the third, the 1 chord.